Welcome to the Focus Champion, a build entirely centered around the new focus skill that was just introduced into the game as a playable skill in 3.14, previously only being a betrayal cosmetic to your skill bar if you accidentally equipped an item with a focus mod on it. Now focus has an actual use case, thanks to patch 3.14 adding additional focus CDR to most of the focus mods. This means that if we stack a lot of these mods, it can lead to a usable uptime of around 70 to 80%, which translates into a 4-second uptime with a 1 to 1.5 second of downtime depending on gear min-maxing. I'll walk you through the trade deal I took building around focus for my champion Cycloner you see here, listing both the pros and the cons of the build. For the pros, during focus, our character is granted high % chance to deal double damage, 120% fortify effect, ailment immunity, shock and chill on enemies, triggering spells when you focus, and up to 50% attack and cast speed, and a free mana cost during focus, of course. Now this is a lot of power, but it comes at the opportunity cost of a mandatory belt slot of Hyperboreus, a suffix slot on most your gear pieces, and gear being generally harder to craft due to the nature of needing Ashling crafted gear or gear that is unveiled and good as is. It also generally does not synergize very well with builds that want unique items, as each gear slot really wants to be a rare for the most part, given focus mods require rare items. For my personal time building around it, I absolutely think this is a trade-off worth considering, in builds that don't need uniques and can make use of all the focus bonuses, for example like melee fizz builds, versus something like a trapper where I already am going to get chill and shock from skitterbots. Then I might consider focus as not the great option to go for. One key aspect of this build I'd like to highlight is Fortify. Early in the build, I showcased tanking the deadliest boss one-shot mechanics in the game, which was solely done via Fortify effect, because the rest of my build has very little defensive investment. I have 75 all res, negative 60 chaos res, 5k HP, and a small amount of block and armor. How can Fortify carry me so hard? Simply put, it's all about that Fortify effect, because Fortify has the base stat of 20% less damage taken from hits. This can be increased via Fortify effect stat, and with enough Fortify effect we can actually become effectively immune to damage from hits. Now I've gone and listed the sources of Fortify effect our build has acquired, along with additional Fortify effect possible to get that I haven't gotten this build to showcase how much is really out there. This leaves us with one chunky character that has one weakness, an Achilles heel: degens. The only hole in the Fortify armor. For the most part, it means we can do all the content pretty easily with the nuisance of having to be very, very careful of degens like the Cirrus Clouds, Shaper Beams, Shaper Vortexes, Maven degen. You get the idea. We're basically feels good, and then we get a degen and we're like, oh crap, this sucks. But other than that, works great. So if you can manage to avoid degens, this build will feel very cozy and safe for you. Now that covers us building into Fortify and focus. Now for the last and final quirky thing of this build, the channeling Chainbreaker technique. This technique is a new way to get full value of Chainbreaker while skipping the rage cost downside. It's fairly simple. By stacking 6 unwavering focus clusters and the tireless nodes on the tree, we can acquire 105% reduced cost of channeling skills, which means Cyclone costs us no rage or mana, granting us good uptime on berserk as well as rage for speed. Full credit of this technique goes to Quantrik and Ruetoo, who I learned about this from. I'll have links to them in the description of this video. Now the channeling technique is great for the speed of the build, but it comes at a cost of currency. Yeah, pretty much just currency. Overall, this build has accomplished something I've been striving to do for a long time: create a fairly good DPS build that could tank the hardest one-shots of the game. Unfortunately, the cost of this build also got away from me in the process of swapping into the channeling Chainbreaker setup. This leaves me wanting to still make something better, and will be a goal for the future that someday I can make a build accomplish these feats on a more reasonable budget. Now without further ado, let's go in-game and break down the gear, the passives, and the build all together. Welcome to the in-game portion of this guide. Now first we're going to start off with gear, then we're going to move into gem links, then the passive tree, flasks, basically the routine to cover every aspect of the build. To start off with, for the gear, the main priorities are life, resistances and focus mods on pretty much every piece of gear. You'll know we got on our gloves, we got attack and cast speed focus. On our boots, we have focus CDR, and we have focus immune to ailments. On our rings, we have focus CDR plus the shock mod. On our amulet, we want the focus CDR mod plus the skills cost no mana mod, but we're in the process of crafting it. I'm about to get an Ashley and I'll slam on it, and hopefully we hit that mod on our suffix. For our helmet, we're going for life, and this is the more unique case. We're also going for Fortify effect. So you want a penitent mask, you want a Crusader orbit, and then you want to craft it with greed essences until you hit Fortify effect. Then you go to Ashling Slam the suffix, and you try to hit the CDR mod. I think it's like a 1 in 3 on the Ashling Slam that you'll hit the CDR mod. Maybe it's a little bit better. I'm not sure. That's just a rough guess on my end from when I was rolling this helmet with Veiled Orbs. For our plate, we want to get good life plus a focus Fortify effect. This is a very lucky craft I had early on. For the most part of the build, I was using this chest piece, which was doing me just fine, which is getting a high life chest piece with res with the Fortify effect mod. You can also opt for a Fortify effect synthesized chest piece, which I believe will take you to the top end possibilities for tankiness, and I think that's a route I would recommend going as well. This chest piece, I'm not going to talk too much about it just because it was a very lucky craft, and I don't think it's very repeatable, and so I just want to move past it. But it's basically, I blind slammed a Hunter Orb and hit attack crit on like a 1 in 20 for the tier 1 version, and I can't believe I hit it, and I was baffled I did. I thought I was going to get like Offering Effect or Fizz taken as Chaos or a lot of other stuff, and somehow I miracled my way into attack crit, so that is just a lucky thing that happened. For our weapon, I want to stress this because it's important for how much you're going to spend on the build. Cane of the Kulamak is not mandatory. You can also go for a rare weapon with high PDPS and then craft on focus double damage. That I think is going to be a lot more affordable and frankly has a higher top end. This staff itself gets about 550 PDPS, something around that. If you're using a staff with 550 PDPS, you probably are thinking in the back of your head, I could have a two-hand that could get up to 1,000 PDPS. Of course, that's on the high end of really good crafts on a two-hand, but it's possible. The point is, you can make a weapon that already deals double damage of what you have here, and then you can craft a double damage chance mod that goes up to 40% on it. So that is probably the best in slot route or the min-maxing route, along with, I think, a 700, 800, 600 PDPS weapon has a chance to be cheaper than Cane of the Kulamak because these mods are rare to get in combination together. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for an Impale, attack speed, Fizz, Cane of the Kulamak, I don't think there are many out there. I know because I was trying to buy one, and I only found one on the market when I was looking for it. So keep that in mind. I'd probably recommend a rare weapon here. So I believe that covers... Oh, I didn't look at the belts real quick. Hyperboreus, it's pretty much mandatory. I think without the CDR of Hyperboreus, the build is going to feel bad for focus. You can get a good amount of CDR on other options like a rare belt, but it's still going to be like half the CDR rate you get from Hyperboreus. I really don't think you can opt in for a different belt without feeling very bad for the focus mod. Besides, it comes with nice things like chill, lucky crit, like damage against that chilled enemies. I think it's still a pretty good solid belt option, even though you're giving up other things that you might have from like an abyssal rare type of belt. So that covers the gear here. For the gloves real quick, I would mention this. If you're going for the super min-max version, I'd recommend going for a awakened melee strike with a awakened Colleen strike, or not awakened, elevated of those things, awaken orb those together. I tried to do this myself. Unfortunately, I bricked into Dex as one of my suffixes. I wanted to get the attack and cast speed while focus mod plus those two mods in the suffix pool. I thought it would have been great AoE for Cyclone. Unfortunately, I bricked into the Dex and I'm still not sure what to do with them. I might sell them. I might try to YOLO and null. I haven't decided. So that's the gear slots. For the flask slots, we're looking at Blood of Karui. I felt like this is pretty necessary because we're most of our sustains from leech, so if we get in the scenario where we're getting damaged from enemies and we can't attack them to leech from them, I usually thought Blood of Karui felt pretty good to heal us back up if we're not able to leech from our enemies. Also, Lion's Roar, melee fizz, huge amount of damage, can't go wrong there. Bottled Faith, another flask that is basically the best flask in the game. If you can't afford it, I'd probably recommend going for a regular flask like a Cinder Swallow potentially, or even I'd recommend going for just a phasing flask or a Jade Flask for more defenses. You got kind of options there, but Sulfur Flask, Bottled Faith, best in slot if you can get it. Onslaught Flask here, like I was saying before, I think I might be tempted to replace this with a Phasing Flask. I was noticing when I was doing ultimatums, I'd spinning around, I'd get the pause scenario where I'd have to choose a selection, and then I'd go back to wanting to spin, and I'd accidentally click like to tell my guy to move, and I'd get stuck on like an object or another monster. I think it would feel really good to have a Phasing Flask. That would make the Onslaught Flask feel less necessary. The way you could make it feel less necessary is just get a Onslaught on Kill Abyssal Jewel somewhere in your build, and I think that could make this feel like you don't need it, and then you can get a Phasing Flask, which would be really feels good for moving through monsters and would pair nicely with Cyclone. And last but not least, of course, we always go for a movement speed flask with the Quicksilver. You can't go wrong there. It always feels good. Always recommend it. Real quick, because I always forget this a lot of times, I should go over Bandits and Pantheon real quickly. For Pantheon, I went before our Kali because the only thing we really die to is damage over time, so taking a little bit less damage over time I think feels good. Another option would be Soul Solaris because you do get 8% reduced elemental damage, which would reduce elemental damage you're taking over time if you haven't been hit recently. So you got two options there. I would go for Solaris or our Kali. And then for our Pantheon here, I had it on Yugal because I ran a Uber Edziri and forgot about it. This is just to take reduced reflect damage plus a Sybils from Edziri. Really, I'd recommend Soul of Relikesh because it gives us reduced Fizz damage taken over time, which makes us a lot more tanky against bleeds and a lot more tanky against Fizz degens from like Cirrus and Elder. Also, being immune to blind is pretty important, and being immune to maim doesn't hurt either. So that's our Pantheons. Let's look over our gem links real quick here. For our gem links, our setup is Cyclone, Infused Channeling, Impale, Pulverize, Brutality, and Fortify support. If you're going for the earlier version of this build, which I'm going to link, it's a version of the build that does not use Berserk, it doesn't use Chainbreaker, it doesn't use a lot of the mana regen rate. You'll notice in that version of the build I use a Shockwave, which feels good for a little bit extra AoE, and it may be a nicer setup if you're looking to do this build on more of a budget. That's what I recommend instead of going for Chainbreaker and Berserk. Sorry I randomly included that about the Gemlink setup, but I just thought of it because in that setup we don't use Fortify because we have Overlord in the build. So you got other options for here. You'd use Melee Fizz instead. For our helmet, we have a trigger socket to spell when you focus. I use this for inconsistent uptime on Assassin's Mark and a Molten Shell every now and then for a little bit extra EHP, a little bit extra tankiness. I also have my Dread Banner in here because we want the increased duration supporting our Dread Banner, so that way when we're in a boss fight and we're trying to tank a big hit, we can drop our Dread Banner and the Fortify effect from the Dread Banner will last longer. So that's why we have it linked here with the Molten Shell and increased duration. After that, on our staff setup, the 6 link's not important. This is simply Theros made me spend more currency than I needed to. We have Berserk, which is not linked to anything here. It's linked, but it doesn't matter that it's linked. We have Leap Slam with faster attacks with Shockwave. That's just so Shockwave feels good, like it hits more enemies. Then we have things like Herald of Purity and Arrogance support. Now, why am I doing that? I'm doing that specifically to trigger First to Strike, Last to Fall. We get Adrenaline whenever we reach low life. So to get the Adrenaline buff, which is a bunch of damage, a bunch of attack and cast speed, a bunch of movement speed, we proc Herald of Purity. It reserves like 58% of our life or something like that. It's a huge reservation. This is a dangerous thing, right? You'll notice in the video I reserve life a bunch of times, but the beauty of min-maxing into Fortify is, even though I'm doing this regularly, I'm reserving this life and then I'm unreserving it, I didn't really feel like I was too much in danger. That's just the beauty of Fortify. Even though I'm on 20%, or not 20%, 40% of my HP, I still felt safe in those ultimatums because of Fortify effect. Just a small note about Fortify is I could just blindly reserve 60% of my life and it didn't usually cause me to die, like ever, because I was already so tanky from Fortify. Just a small note there I'd like to talk about. But anyways, besides that, let's move on to our next gem links. We have Ancestral Warchief with Protector with multiple totems. This allows you to get both the buffs from Ancestral Warchief and Ancestral Protector because it gives you 2 additional totems, so you can summon one, then the other, so that way you get the more damage from Warchief and the more attack speed from Protector. We also have Maim support in here, so that way they would maim our enemies and make them take increased Fizz damage. That's our link setup for our gloves. For our boots, we have Blood and Sand and Pride. These are auras that give us more AoE and a lot more fizz damage to our enemies, along with Portal and Precision. We use Precision here because now we are champion, which means if we've taunted an enemy, they can't evade our attacks, so we don't need that much accuracy. Still, I think it's a good idea to get a little bit of accuracy, so that way you can actually hit them and then taunt them to begin with. So that's why we have a low level precision here, and it gives us a little bit of crit, which isn't too bad. So I believe that covers the gem links. Now let's go and look at the actual passive tree. Starting off with the Ascendancy, I went for Master of Metal, specifically for the additional Impale and the fizz we get from Impale and extra armor. I like this node a lot for a lot of damage, and it's great for just building around Impale. It's hard to beat for damage. First Strike, Last to Fall. This is specifically because I wanted more speed in the build. Initially, I was using a Unstoppable Hero because it gave us a lot of extra defenses, gave us stun immunity, gave us some attack speed, and it felt good, but I ended up swapping it for First Strike, Last to Fall just for the movement speed and extra damage we get from it. I think this is more of a... This is more high maintenance, I would say, because we have to constantly proc our Herald of Purity and unproc it. It's more maintenance with better min-maxing in it, so if you don't mind pressing extra buttons, I think this is a great way to go. If you mind pressing extra buttons, then I would just go for Unstoppable Hero. Another thing I should note here is we went for Conqueror and Worthy Foe. This is specifically so that way we can get the ability to not have to spec into accuracy at all, as well as taking less damage from enemies, reduce damage from enemies, and enemies take increased damage. These nodes are just super powerful, and they feel pretty good on a champion. Would recommend. Now, after our Ascendancy, for our general tree, it's pretty much all about the Fortify effect nodes. We have to go to those, along with getting 2 Voices clusters. This is the mandatory setup to get Chainbreaker in the build. Before we did Chainbreaker, we did not need 2 clusters, and I will have a link to that PoE of the early stage of the build. I think that build had more HP, had more tankiness, but less damage and less speed. So that's the trade-off you're making, along with the earlier version being much, much cheaper. You'll notice in this version of the build, I have a 3 passive voices. This was very expensive, but I kind of needed it with how many passives I wanted to get on the tree. Without it, you can go for a 5 passive clusters, which is way more affordable. You'll simply have to level 2 additional times because you save 2 additional passives that you'll have to make up for if you go for a 5 passive instead of a 3 passive here. Other than that, we go for Lethal Pride with a Chainbreaker. Ideally, the best case scenario would be you get Lethal Pride and then you get Fortify effect on a bunch of these extra nodes here. We got Fortify effect once with Lethal Pride. This is a great option for Chainbreaker. It's one of the best options I rolled in 20 Divines. But ideally, if you don't do the Chainbreaker route, you don't care if you get a Koya or not, which opens up the possibilities to get better Lethal Prides that have more Fortify effect or more double damage. They have better additional nodes with them. So keep that in mind. That's another cost of going Chainbreaker. Outside of the clusters, we went for the staff crit nodes, life nodes around the tree, tireless, the fortify nodes, and the melee crit nodes where we could get them because they're so high value for crit. That pretty much sums up the tree. If I don't go for the cluster jewels here, you'll notice in the alternate tree, I'm going to link, I go for Golem's Blood, I go for a Lethal Pride potentially here, I go for Constitution. There's other options. You can go for more accuracy in the tree. There's other benefits you can get. Another thing I did with this tree is I had to cap out my dex and int requirements with 2 split personalities. This feels pretty bad, but with so many passives being required, we kind of had to because I couldn't even afford to go for the 30 dex node here, 30 int node here, 30 dex node here, 30 int node here. Also having mana regen rate as a requirement on our gear. We couldn't really afford to get dex or int on a lot of our suffixes of gear pieces. So those are costs for going for Chainbreaker that make it more expensive. Of course, for all the cluster jewels, we're basically going for Unwavering Focus plus things like Rapid Infusion. I think I do that twice, and then other clusters I go for are Precise Focus plus Unwavering Focus. I think I do that for the rest of the clusters. I do that because I felt like I needed the crit chance and crit multi from those. I think it was better damage than the infusion effect. So that's pretty much the tree setup there. You can see the build went from basically a 5 on expense straight all the way up to a 10. Once you add in the need to get the cluster jewels, this gets more expensive getting voices, and then you add in the cost of having to gear specifically for getting mana regen rate, stuff like that. It adds a lot of cost to the build. Definitely something to consider. If you're going for a less expensive version of this build, I highly recommend the way I was doing it before. I went for Chainbreaker, but you'll be a decent amount slower. Mapping will feel worse, but you'll still be very good at bossing. So that is the tree there. That's the Ascendancy. That's the gear. That's the passives. This build, I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I'm really happy and really excited that I was able to create something that could do good boss damage and tank the one-shots. Unfortunately, it came at the cost of being quite expensive, and that's what I feel bad about. I feel like I failed in that aspect because it's an expensive build. And there's always the argument where you say, oh, if you put a good amount of budget, you can make anything do the end game, etc. And it feels bad to have an expensive build when I feel like, you know, we can do better. So for the goal for the future, it's going to be to make a build that does good damage, that can tank the one-shots, that isn't so expensive. That's something that I'm going to try to strive for as one of my goals for future builds. Probably not a lot of builds that are going to be able to hit that threshold, but it's something I'm going to try to do in the future. Potentially we'll eventually succeed at that. Until then, we're just going to keep messing around with cool and unique interactions that I decide are interesting to me and I want to mess with. So hopefully you guys like the build. Hopefully it opens up your perspective for the builds you can make around specifically the focus mechanic, and maybe you guys can make something cool with it and I don't know, change the meta with your own ingenuity and creative ways. Appreciate you all watching the video. Thanks for your time, and you guys have a good one. See you next time.